So I want to take some time just talking through what are the qualities of a leader. How can we tell who a leader is and how they're using the gifts that they've been given for the sake of what God wants to do in the world? Not just because they have gifts, they have abilities, but doing those in a way that really represent Jesus to a watching world. And there's a ton of things we can talk about here, but I mostly want to try to cover some of the different areas that I've found over time that people just sort of misunderstand or misinterpret, or ways that they disqualify themselves, or frankly don't quite understand how maybe they're, doing things that are limiting the scope of their leadership. So let's just start here. What is a leader? I'm going to give you a few things. What is a leader? The scriptures are really, really clear that a leader is a servant, fundamentally. 1 Peter chapter 5, John chapter 13, where Jesus gets up and he washes the disciples' feet. Philippians chapter 2 describes how God became a man, and not just a man, but a servant, and not just a servant, but someone who would die, not just someone who would die, but someone who would die on a cross. And so at every place that we see Jesus as a model of leadership, he's a servant. And servant leaders never interfere between an individual and God. They believe in the priesthood of all believers, and that Jesus is a unique mediator between God and man. And you're not going to be Jesus. So as a servant, you're coming along and helping people discover who they're supposed to be and how they live a life with God. Servant leaders, they have a team spirit. They use their influence to build teams. They're always seeking to promote the whole, not just themselves. And that demonstrates that they're a servant. They're looking that their best work shows up on other people's desk. They're not self-promoting, they're promoting the whole. To be a servant leader, you have to have a passionate desire to understand and care about people, right? Because if you're trying to serve them, you need to understand their hurts, their desires, their temptations, their sin, where they have joy in their life, what the needs are of the people that they're serving. Servant leaders are God-centered. They're not others-centered. They're not self-centered, meaning they're not fundamentally just doing everything for others. They're going, no, I'm serving God first, and as I serve God, I'm figuring out how to serve others, not just for their convenience, but for their best. And we can lose track of that if we're just thinking about others all the time. We look to develop others and lead out of relationship if we're servant leaders. Well, that's really the bottom line. The relationship we have with God informs the way we want to serve and lead others. So we're to be servant leaders and not self-promoting, not demanding, and not trying to pretend like we're God. Leaders are also supposed to be a model. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and 2, 1 Timothy 4. If you want to lead, you don't just tell people what to do, you actually demonstrate it to them. You're a model. And at any place that you notice something's not happening in the people you think you're leading or influencing, the first place you look is the mirror. You say, am I doing this? Am I leading this way? Am I demonstrating this in a way that people can follow? Because if you're not, you can't really demand it of others. So am I doing that? Leaders are models. Leaders, this sounds silly, but leaders are leaders. They're not pointers. They don't tell people where to go, actually show them where they're going. Again, it's sort of like being a model, but they lead. Leaders are inherently generous. They're givers. To be a leader means that you're thinking about your money differently. You're thinking about your time differently. You think about your stuff differently. You think about your relationships differently. What you have, everything you have is on loan to you. And it's not just for you, it's for the sake of others. They're generous. And so whenever I think about leaders, whenever I'm looking to see if someone has leadership on their life, I'm looking, how generous are they with their time, their money, their relationships, their stuff? And a leader is also a multiplier. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, Paul talks about how he intentionally led Timothy. And he wants Timothy to lead others who will lead others. You can see the rings of leadership. And so leaders aren't just thinking about managing environments or putting out products, but they're investing in people who invest in people that invest in people. And this follows a predictable pattern. We see Jesus doing it. Actually, Jesus bets everything on the way he invests in 12 men as being the models for everything the kingdom of God was going to be moving forward. And to borrow from John Wimber, the guy who founded the Vineyard, he would talk about IRTDMN. That what we do as leaders is we identify other leaders, we recruit them to what it is that we believe that God wants to do in and through their life. Then we train them to do that work by modeling it to them, then having them do it in front of us. Then we send them to do it and report back, and then they're doing it. We're asking them to train others. So that's training. Training isn't just education, it's doing with people. Then we deploy them. We send them out to do the work, but then we check in and we measure, how are they doing? Then we monitor that work continually. How's it going? What are we measuring? How are we keeping up with them? And then we're nurturing them through that process. And then we ask them to IRTDMN others. That's real leadership. Leadership multiplies itself. It doesn't just sort of get stuck in the leader managing teams of people. So maybe we could just stop right there. Maybe you should be asking yourself, how many of these things fit me, the way that I lead? Would people say I'm a servant? Would people say that I'm a model? Would people say that I'm generous and that I can see multiplied leadership in my life? Now, these things don't just happen accidentally. They're cultivated, and you have to build a certain culture within your own life to be this kind of leader. Here's what leaders aren't. Here's some of the things leaders are. Here's what leaders aren't. Leaders aren't a certain set of gifts. Leaders might have certain attributes or values about them, like we just talked about. But gifts, you need not be a certain set of gifts. You can be any different kinds of gifts and still use those gifts to influence others in the way we just talked about. Leaders also aren't a certain type of personality. There's introverted and extroverted leaders. There's every kind of personality can have leadership in the world while still demonstrating those different values and behaviors we talked about earlier. Leaders also don't have to have a certain style of leadership. There's all kinds of different styles of leadership. Several factors kind of relate to what it takes to be a certain kind of leader. And so you can be all kinds of different leaders. And a lot of that style will depend on the personality of the leader, some of how their gifts work, but it'll also depend on what's the size and the need of the group being led. Meaning, if you're leading a church of 1,000 people, you have to lead a certain way with a certain kind of style, maybe, versus if you're sitting with 5 or 10 people leading. It also depends on what that group is trying to get done. What is it that's trying to be done, or what are the needs of the group will dictate the different kind of style of leadership. So listen, all of those things are really flexible, and sometimes people try to take themselves out because they don't fit a prescribed gift set, a prescribed personality, a certain style. I just want to tell you, no matter what your gifts, whatever your personality, whatever kind of your tendencies by way of style, you still can be a leader in the ways we described about earlier. Well, what do you do if you're a reluctant leader? There's lots of reluctant leaders out there. They're like, well, I don't know. People keep telling me I should lead, but I don't really want to lead. Here's a couple of things I'd recommend to overcome some of those problems, because I see this all the time. Here's one. Settle the issue of calling. Ask God to speak to you. This sounds really simple, but ask God for an inward call. God, how have you made me? What's the mark you want me to leave in the world? Not just manage my own life, my own stuff. How do you want me to use these gifts for the sake of how the world will be a different place because I've been here? That's inward call. That's asking God to speak to you. And then ask for outward calling. Look at your friends around you and say, do you think that I could do this? Look at people. People say I could lead a small group. People say I should help out the kids. People say I should help lead worship. What do you think? And you need an inward and an outward call. Sometimes people have an inward call, like, hey, I'm supposed to preach, but nobody around you thinks you should preach. Or you think, I'm supposed to sing. I love singing. People are like, no, you should not sing. There's no way you should sing. Other times people will tell you should do this, but you're not sure you have a conviction from God. Ask God to speak to you. So settle the issue of calling. Next thing I'd recommend is just put your eyes on Jesus. Stop focusing on yourself and what you think and what you need and what you have and what you don't have, what your time is. Look at Jesus, the one who gave everything for you, who loves you. Don't be motivated just out of what you sort of see around you. Ask God, who are you and how would you lead me to do this? And when you put your eyes on Jesus, you begin to speak to him and you consider him, it's amazing how things can get clearer. And here's something that could help you. Consider many of God's best leaders were reluctant in the scriptures. Moses is like, I don't want to do this. Gideon is like, wrong guy. Jeremiah is like, I'm not ready for this. We could go through the Bible. So many people were reluctant, but God said, but I made you for this. And they finally went, okay, I relent. It's okay if you're reluctant, but settle the issue with God and invite other people into that process. I want to finish by, after I just said all this about trying to learn how to lead, I want to finish with what might seem discouraging, but yet what I think is important, which is I think it's really important you count the cost, because leadership does cost you. And Jesus over and over in the Gospels challenges us, count the cost of leadership. Count the cost of what it means to be a disciple. And the scriptures are really clear. Luke chapter 9, if you really want to find yourself, you're going to have to lose it. It's going to cost. So I'm going to give you 7 quick costs, okay, of leadership. And the reason I give you these is so that you aren't surprised when they happen to you. Sometimes people start leading and they're like, what happened? I must be doing something wrong. No, that's just part of it. I find myself saying that constantly as a pastor as I'm relating with other pastors and leaders. No, this is just part of it. This is just part of the deal. It's okay. You can move through this. First is the cost of protectionism. If you begin to lead, people will hand you bills that have been rung up by other people. For me, as a pastor, I'm a man, if you couldn't tell, watching. So I get handed the bills for every father, every brother, every old boss, whatever the old pain is, it gets rung up and handed to me because they're frustrated. They just take that old pain and they put it on me, and that's just part of the deal. And learning as a leader to go, you know what? I don't have to protect myself all the time. I'm not always on trial. I don't have to be defensive. This is just part of the deal. This is the cost. That's part of it. Is people will hand you bills that are not yours from some old pain they've had. The other cost is criticism. If you don't like being criticized, it's really hard to be a leader. Whenever you stand up and say, hey, we're going to do this or not do that or do it in this way and not that way, people are going to criticize you. And basically, here's the basic thought for you with that. If you can't be criticized, it basically means you're immature. That's it. Being a grown-up means people aren't going to all like what you do. And when people criticize, you have to be able to listen and go, okay, I weigh that. I'll consider that against this. And leadership comes with criticism. There's no way to lead without people criticizing you. It's just part of the deal. Fatigue. Along the way, leaders get tired because we're taking on more than most people. People hand us stuff that we don't know how to carry. And often leaders will say, well, I'd rather, burn out for God than bust out for the devil or whatever, stupid stuff like this. Listen, I'm not saying you should live fatigued. You need to find rest in God. You need to build good habits. But the point is this, you get tired. You get more tired than most people because you're taking on more. And it's trying to, in those moments of fatigue, not just move towards apathy or just trying harder, but finding God and finding the rest that you need. But you're going to have to be more vigilant if you're a leader. It's just part of the cost. Loneliness. If you lead, you get lonely. Friendships change. Everything changes in the way that you relate with others. And sometimes you go, man, these used to be my friends, but now they're treating me differently. As a pastor, I remember when I first started to lead the church, people stopped calling me to hang out. I thought, man, they don't like me anymore. No, it's just they don't want the pastor at their party, or whatever. I get it. And it's part of the cost. And you can't find a single leader in the Bible that didn't experience some form of loneliness. It's part of the cost. But it's a way that God grows us and thickens us and strengthens us in his kingdom. Loneliness. A few more. Making unpleasant decisions. That's one of the costs. Sometimes you got to make decisions that people aren't going to like. That you can't please everybody. You have to make a decision that's going to happen because it's now that's going to affect some people negatively. You can't do everything for everybody all the time. And that's just part of leading. It's part of the cost. And you do your best to explain and empathize and demonstrate you care. And yet, nonetheless, people will get upset. That's just part of the deal. Fear of failure. You have to overcome this. This is a cost. Sometimes you're going to fail, and that's just the way it is. And you have to, if you want to lead for a long time, you have to adjust your thinking and your living to believe that failure is really just another opportunity to learn. That you fail as a means to growth, and that failure isn't death, it's opportunity. And it's another opportunity to be humble, and you're going to make mistakes, but at least you're doing them with the purest heart you possibly can, and you change and you repair, but it's just part of the deal of leading. If you want to live perfectly and have everything go well and have everybody happy with you, never lead. Live a very small life. This is part of the cost, as there are failures. And the last one is really hard, but you also see it all over the scriptures, is rejection. People will reject you. They will, in their disappointment, just say, I don't want to do this. I mean, I can't tell you how many people over the years have just walked away. And I often try to tell myself, oh, it's not about me. It's about this or that. But sometimes it's just about me. They just don't want to, they just reject me personally, not just the church, but me. And it's battling through the feelings of being misunderstood and, not characterized. And I want to chase people around and make sure they understand what I meant and I didn't mean. And I look at Jesus and I think, if they rejected him, then they're going to reject me. Was there anyone more attractive? Was there anyone that placed his words just so precisely? And yet he knew not everybody's going to follow. Not everybody's going to want to do what I'm doing. This is a cost. It's a cost of rejection. But listen, all of these costs are so that we become more like Jesus. Everything I just mentioned there is stuff Jesus experienced. And in this, we become more like him. And we can say, as the writer of Hebrews says, there's nothing we experience that he does not understand, he's not intimately acquainted with. And as we lead and as we grow in these places of leadership, we become more like him. We grow. We understand him more fully. And then in that, we also get to participate in how he's affecting people's lives. And we only have one life to live. Our life is but a breath. It's but a breath. And then he'll make all things new again. It's worth it, but it's worthy to understand what the costs are.